In 1954, just months before his death, Albert Einstein wrote a letter that was immediately classified and hidden from the public eye. "I have discovered something that challenges everything we know about consciousness and what happens after we die," Einstein wrote in this personal correspondence to philosopher Bertrand Russell. The contents of this letter remained sealed in a vault at Princeton University until 2023, when it was finally declassified following a lengthy legal battle. What follows is the exclusive transcript of Einstein's final interview, conducted just 3 weeks before his passing. An interview that was suppressed for nearly 7 decades due to its revolutionary claims about the nature of human consciousness and its survival beyond physical death. The room was dim, with afternoon light filtering through heavy curtains. Albert Einstein sat in his worn leather chair, his wild white hair more disheveled than usual. The famous physicist looked tired, but his eyes sparkled with the same curiosity that had revolutionized our understanding of the universe. "Thank you for coming," he said softly, his German accent still pronounced despite decades in America. "There are things I must share before I go, things I've kept hidden from the scientific community." The interviewer, James Harrington from Scientific American, nodded silently, unsure of what to expect from the world's most brilliant mind as he faced his final days. "They will say I've gone senile," Einstein continued with a knowing smile, "but the mathematics don't lie. I've been working on equations that suggest consciousness isn't produced by the brain. Rather, the brain acts as a receiver, tuning into consciousness that exists in another dimension, what you might call the quantum field." He paused, reaching for his pipe on the side table. His hands trembled slightly as he packed it with tobacco. "For decades, I've publicly maintained that death is final. Privately, my calculations suggest otherwise. The quantum entanglement patterns I've discovered indicate that what we call consciousness exists outside of space-time constraints." The interviewer shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "Dr. Einstein, are you suggesting that we survive death?" Einstein lit his pipe deliberately, the smoke creating swirling patterns in the beam of sunlight. "I'm not suggesting it," he replied firmly. "I'm stating it as a mathematical certainty. My equations show that consciousness is not localized in the brain, but exists in what I call the consciousness field, a fifth dimension beyond our perceptible 4-dimensional space-time. The brain is merely a transceiver, not the originator of consciousness." He stood up with surprising energy and moved to his cluttered desk, pulling out a folder filled with pages of complex mathematical formulas. "Look here," he said, pointing to a particularly dense equation. "This demonstrates quantum coherence patterns that cannot be explained by conventional physics. These patterns suggest information is not lost when the brain ceases to function. It's merely transmitted back to the consciousness field." Harrington stared at the equations, barely comprehending the advanced mathematics, but sensing the gravity of what Einstein was revealing. "But Dr. Einstein, this contradicts everything in modern neuroscience. We know that damage to the brain affects consciousness. How do you explain that?" Einstein nodded, as if expecting the question. "Think of a radio," he said. "If you damage the radio, the broadcast becomes distorted or disappears entirely. But does that mean the broadcast itself has been damaged? No, only the receiver has been affected. The broadcast continues to exist independently of the radio. The brain works similarly. It doesn't generate consciousness. It receives and processes it from the consciousness field." Outside, rain began to fall, pattering against the windows. Einstein moved back to his chair, his movements slower now, betraying his failing health. "I've kept this theory private because I couldn't yet prove it experimentally," he admitted. "But now, facing my own mortality, I feel compelled to share it. The implications are profound, not just for science but for humanity's understanding of existence itself." He fell silent for a moment, watching the raindrops trace patterns down the window pane. "Death, Mr. Harrington, is not an end. It's a transition, a change of state rather than a cessation of being." The interviewer found his voice, though it was barely above a whisper. "Why are you revealing this now?" Einstein looked directly at him, his gaze intensifying. "Because fear of death cripples humanity. It drives our worst impulses: greed, power, conquest. If people understood that consciousness continues, that death is merely a doorway rather than an end, perhaps we would make different choices. Perhaps we would care more for each other and for our planet." He tapped his pipe against the ashtray. "Besides, I've never been one to withhold knowledge, no matter how uncomfortable it might make the scientific establishment. But this sounds more like spirituality than science, Harrington ventured cautiously. Einstein laughed, a warm, genuine sound that filled the room. The distinction between science and spirituality is artificial and unfortunate. Both seek truth. The greatest scientists throughout history understood this. Newton, Maxwell, Planck all saw no contradiction between the spiritual and the scientific. The universe is more mysterious and interconnected than our fragmented disciplines suggest. He rose again, this time moving to a bookshelf where he pulled down a worn notebook. My quantum entanglement calculations show that consciousness particles, what I call psychons, remain entangled regardless of physical distance or state. When the brain dies, these psychons don't cease to exist. They simply change their configuration in the consciousness field. He opened the notebook, revealing diagrams that looked like complex wave patterns interacting with spiraling vortices. These patterns emerge consistently in my calculations, suggesting an underlying order to consciousness that transcends physical boundaries. The rain outside had intensified, drumming against the roof of Einstein's modest Princeton home. Thunder rumbled in the distance. I've conducted thought experiments involving quantum mechanics and consciousness for decades, Einstein continued, his voice gaining strength as he spoke about his most secret work. What we call intuition or inspiration is actually our limited conscious mind receiving information from the broader consciousness field. This explains phenomena like simultaneous discovery, where multiple scientists reach the same conclusion independently. They're tapping into the same field. Harrington leaned forward, captivated despite his skepticism. Dr. Einstein, if what you're saying is true, it would transform our understanding of reality itself. Einstein nodded soberly. Precisely. And that's why I believe this knowledge has been suppressed, not through some grand conspiracy, but through the natural resistance of the scientific community to paradigm shifts. We scientists claim to follow evidence, but we're just as susceptible to dogma as any religion. The physicist walked to the window, gazing out at the storm. His silhouette against the grey light seemed somehow both frail and imposing. I've spent my life studying the physical universe, he said softly, only to discover that the physical is merely a shadow of something far more complex and enduring. Consciousness is the fundamental reality, not matter. Matter emerges from consciousness, not the other way around. He turned back to face Harrington, his expression intense. The equations don't lie. They show that information, the essential component of consciousness, cannot be destroyed. It can only be transformed. When we die, the information pattern that constitutes our consciousness returns to the field, perhaps to be reconfigured in ways we cannot yet comprehend. He paused, seeming to search for the right words. It's like a wave returning to the ocean. The wave doesn't cease to exist. It simply rejoins the greater body of water, its energy and information preserved. Lightning flashed, momentarily illuminating the room with stark brightness. There's a unifying principle to the universe that goes beyond our current physics, Einstein continued, after the thunder subsided. I've called it the unified consciousness theory. It connects quantum mechanics, relativity, and consciousness in a single mathematical framework. The implications are staggering, not just for our understanding of death, but for humanity's place in the cosmos. Harrington found himself struggling to maintain journalistic detachment. But how can we test this theory? Science requires empirical evidence, not just mathematical models. Einstein smiled gently. You're absolutely right. That's the next frontier. I've proposed several experiments involving quantum entanglement and consciousness that could provide empirical evidence. Unfortunately, I won't live to see them conducted. He returned to his chair, sitting heavily. But others will carry this work forward. The truth cannot remain hidden forever. The conversation paused as Einstein's housekeeper entered with tea. She moved quietly, placing the tray on a side table before departing with a concerned glance at her employer. Einstein looked tired now, the burst of energy fading. He sipped his tea before continuing. The persistence of consciousness explains many phenomena we currently dismiss: near-death experiences, intuitive knowledge, the sense of connectedness reported by mystics throughout history. These aren't supernatural. They're perfectly natural manifestations of the consciousness field that our current science is too limited to explain. Dr. Einstein, Harrington said carefully, if consciousness survives death, does that mean, do we retain our identity, our memories, or do we dissolve into this field you describe? Einstein considered the question thoughtfully. My calculations suggest that the information pattern that constitutes individual identity persists in some form. Whether we experience that as continuous awareness, I cannot say with mathematical certainty, but the essential pattern, what makes you uniquely you, appears to be preserved in the field. He set down his teacup with a slight tremor in his hand. Think of it like this. When you dream, you experience a reality that seems completely real while you're in it. Your consciousness operates in a different state, but retains its essential nature. Death may be similar, a transition to another state of being rather than an end. Einstein's eyes seemed to look beyond the room, as if seeing something invisible to Harrington. I believe we maintain our core identity, while also expanding into something greater. The rain had stopped, and weak sunlight began to filter through the clouds. There's something else, Einstein said, his voice lower now. These equations suggest that all consciousness is fundamentally connected. What we experience as separate minds may be more like different vantage points within a unified field. This has profound implications for how we treat each other and our world. He reached for his pipe again, his movements deliberate and precise, despite his failing health. If consciousness is the fundamental reality, and we are all expressions of it, then the divisions we create between us are ultimately illusions. That sounds almost religious, Harrington observed. Einstein chuckled softly. Perhaps religions at their core were early intuitive recognitions of this reality. Before they became dogmatic institutions, they were attempts to articulate the connection between consciousness and the universe. My equations are simply expressing this relationship in mathematical language. He drew on his pipe, the smoke curling upward. The greatest scientific insights often align with ancient wisdom. This shouldn't surprise us. Truth is truth, regardless of how we approach it. The conversation continued as afternoon faded toward evening. Einstein spoke of experiments that could test his theory, of the resistance he expected from the scientific establishment, and of his hope that future generations would be more open to expanding the boundaries of science. The materialist paradigm has reached its limits, he said. It cannot explain consciousness, quantum non-locality, or the fine-tuning of universal constants. We need a new framework that incorporates consciousness as a fundamental feature of reality, not an accidental byproduct of neural activity. As darkness fell and lamps were lit, Einstein seemed to grow weary. I've shared this with only a handful of people, he admitted. Most would dismiss it as the ramblings of an old man, but the mathematics is sound. The theory is consistent with quantum mechanics and relativity. It simply extends our understanding into realms we've been reluctant to explore scientifically. He leaned forward, his voice intense despite his fatigue. Promise me you'll share this. People deserve to know that death is not the end. It's merely a transition to another state of being. Harrington nodded, feeling the weight of the responsibility. I promise, Dr. Einstein. But do you truly believe the scientific community is ready for this? Einstein's response was immediate and certain. No, they are not ready. But readiness must not be a prerequisite for truth. When I published Relativity, many weren't ready for that either. Truth doesn't require our readiness or approval. It simply is. As the interview concluded, Einstein walked slowly to the door with Harrington. Remember, he said, placing a hand on the journalist's shoulder, consciousness is not produced by the brain. The brain is merely the receiver. When it stops functioning, consciousness returns to the field from which it came. There is no true death, only transformation. With those words, he bid Harrington goodbye. 3 weeks later, Albert Einstein passed away, his revolutionary theory of consciousness buried with him, until now. The transcript of this interview was immediately classified by government agencies concerned about its implications for national security and social stability. Einstein's papers on the unified consciousness theory were sealed in Princeton's archives, accessible only to researchers with the highest security clearances. For decades, this knowledge remained hidden from the public, deemed too revolutionary and disruptive to be shared openly. Now, as this information finally comes to light, we must ask ourselves why such profound knowledge was kept from humanity for so long. Perhaps Einstein was right. Understanding that consciousness survives death would transform how we live, how we treat each other, and how we view our place in the universe. The implications extend far beyond scientific curiosity into the very foundations of human society and purpose. What do you think about Einstein's hidden theory? Could consciousness truly exist beyond the brain? persisting after death? Or was this simply the final speculation of a brilliant mind confronting his own mortality? Share your thoughts below. Subscribe for more declassified revelations, and join us in exploring the boundaries between science and the ultimate mystery of human existence. For as Einstein himself might have said, the most beautiful experience we can have is the mysterious. It is the fundamental emotion that stands at the cradle of true art and true science. But there is more to this story that has only recently come to light. 1 month after Harrington's interview with Einstein, the journalist was approached by a mysterious figure who identified himself only as Dr. Maxwell. They met in a small cafe in Washington, D.C., far from the watchful eyes of government agencies. "I worked with Einstein on the unified consciousness theory," Maxwell revealed in hushed tones. "There are aspects of his research that he didn't share with you, aspects that even Einstein was reluctant to fully articulate because of their profound implications." Maxwell slid a thin folder across the table. Inside were photocopies of equations and diagrams even more complex than those Einstein had shown Harrington. "Einstein's calculations don't just suggest that consciousness survives death," Maxwell explained. "They indicate that consciousness exists outside of linear time altogether. What we perceive as past, present, and future are simply different expressions of a unified consciousness field that encompasses all temporal dimensions." The implications were staggering. If consciousness exists outside of linear time, then in some sense everyone who has ever lived or will ever live exists simultaneously in the consciousness field. Einstein called it the eternal now, Maxwell continued. He believed that when we die, we don't just continue existing, we expand into an awareness that transcends temporal limitations entirely. According to Maxwell, Einstein had conducted classified experiments with the military that demonstrated non-local consciousness effects. They tested individuals in electromagnetically shielded rooms, completely isolated from all known forms of communication, Maxwell explained. Yet these subjects were able to access information that should have been impossible for them to know, details about events happening miles away, and in some cases events that hadn't yet occurred. These experiments, Maxwell claimed, were the real reason Einstein's consciousness research was classified. "The military immediately recognized the strategic implications," he said. "If consciousness can transcend space-time limitations, it opens possibilities for non-local communication and even a form of temporal reconnaissance, accessing information from the future." The folder contained partial reports of these experiments, with most details redacted, but enough information to substantiate Maxwell's claims. When Harrington asked why he was sharing this classified information, Maxwell's expression became grave. Einstein wanted humanity to know the truth about consciousness. He believed it could transform our civilization, moving us beyond materialism and the fears that drive conflict. But powerful interests prefer that we remain ignorant. It makes us easier to control. He glanced nervously around the cafe. "I'm risking everything by sharing this with you, but Einstein was right. This knowledge belongs to humanity, not to governments or corporations." Maxwell explained that a small group of scientists had continued Einstein's consciousness research in secret. "We've refined his mathematics and conducted our own experiments," he said. "We've even developed technologies based on his principles, devices that can enhance the brain's natural ability to receive information from the consciousness field." These technologies, Maxwell claimed, could eventually allow direct communication with the consciousness of individuals who had died, though he emphasized that such applications were still theoretical. Most remarkably, Maxwell revealed that Einstein had experienced what he called consciousness expansion events, moments when he believed his awareness had temporarily extended beyond his physical body. He described accessing information that would have been impossible for him to know through conventional means, Maxwell said. Details about distant locations, conversations happening elsewhere, and even glimpses of future events that later came to pass exactly as he had foreseen. Einstein had documented these experiences meticulously, but kept them private, fearing they would undermine his scientific credibility. He was caught in a dilemma, Maxwell explained. As a scientist, he wanted empirical evidence. As a human being, he was experiencing phenomena that defied conventional scientific explanation. His mathematical work on the unified consciousness theory was his attempt to reconcile these two worlds. The most revolutionary aspect of Einstein's theory, according to Maxwell, was the suggestion that consciousness might be the fundamental reality from which physical reality emerges, not the other way around. Einstein came to believe that the universe is essentially mental rather than material, Maxwell said. Matter, energy, space, and time are expressions of consciousness, not its source. This inverts our entire scientific paradigm. This perspective aligns with ancient philosophical traditions like Vedanta and certain interpretations of quantum mechanics, particularly the observer effect. Einstein was moving toward what he called the primacy of consciousness, Maxwell continued. He believed this would be the next scientific revolution, more profound than relativity or quantum mechanics, because it would unify them while also explaining the most mysterious aspect of existence, consciousness itself. Before they parted, Maxwell gave Harrington a small device resembling a pocket watch. Einstein developed this prototype, he said. It measures subtle quantum fluctuations that he believed correspond to consciousness field activity. Keep it with you. If the needle moves, it means you're receiving information from beyond ordinary perception. Maxwell then disappeared into the crowded street, never to contact Harrington again. For weeks after this meeting, Harrington debated what to do with the information. Publishing it would likely result in government intervention and the discrediting of his career. Yet keeping it secret seemed a betrayal of both Einstein's wishes and the public's right to know. Before he could decide, Harrington began experiencing strange phenomena himself. The device Maxwell had given him would occasionally register activity, and during these moments, Harrington would have sudden insights or awareness of information he couldn't possibly know through conventional means. Most disturbing were the vivid dreams in which Einstein appeared, continuing their conversation as if no time had passed. The boundary between life and death is more permeable than we realize, Einstein told him in one such dream. I'm communicating with you from within the consciousness field now. The mathematics I developed while alive only hinted at the reality I'm now experiencing directly. When Harrington awoke from these dreams, he would find the measuring device registering intense activity. He began documenting these experiences, creating a journal that eventually ran to hundreds of pages. I can no longer dismiss these as mere dreams or hallucinations, he wrote. The information I'm receiving is too specific, too verifiable through subsequent research. Either I'm experiencing a profound delusion, or Einstein was right about the nature of consciousness, and he's proving it by communicating with me from beyond physical death. In what would be his final journal entry before his mysterious disappearance in 1957, Harrington wrote, Einstein's consciousness theory is not just a scientific breakthrough, it's the key to understanding humanity's place in the universe. We are not isolated beings constrained by our physical bodies and limited lifespans. We are expressions of a unified consciousness field that transcends space, time, and even death. Einstein didn't just discover this truth, he's demonstrating it by reaching across the boundary we call death to continue sharing his knowledge. The journal and Maxwell's documents remained hidden for decades, sealed in a safety deposit box with instructions that they be opened only after Harrington's death or in 2023, whichever came first. When the box was finally opened, these materials, along with Einstein's original classified interview, presented a cohesive, if revolutionary, theory about the nature of consciousness and its survival beyond physical death. Today, neuroscientists working with quantum physicists are beginning to explore theories remarkably similar to Einstein's unified consciousness theory. Research into non-local consciousness effects, quantum coherence in brain microtubules, and the fundamental nature of information in the universe is gradually moving mainstream science toward perspectives that Einstein apparently explored in private decades ago. If Einstein was right, the implications are profound. Death is not the end, but a transition. Consciousness is fundamental rather than emergent. We are all expressions of a unified field that transcends physical limitations. And perhaps most remarkably, communication across the boundary we call death may be possible with the right understanding and technology. As you read this previously classified information, consider its significance for your own life and understanding of reality. If consciousness continues beyond death, how might that change your priorities, your fears, your treatment of others? If we are all expressions of a unified consciousness field, how should that reshape our sense of separation and conflict? Einstein's final theory may not just revolutionize science, it might transform humanity's understanding of existence itself. Join us in exploring this profound territory at the intersection of cutting-edge physics and the eternal human quest to understand consciousness and mortality. Like, share, and comment below with your thoughts on Einstein's hidden consciousness theory. Do you believe consciousness survives death? Have you had experiences that suggest consciousness transcends physical limitations? The conversation Einstein began in that Princeton living room in 1954 continues today, and you're now part of it.